I want to make sure that everyone here, I think you know Erin is our executive presbyter of Donegal Presbytery. I think you've preached here twice before and been here many times. Just wanted to make sure that everyone knew. Thank you very much, Erin, for being here.
And I am so delighted to be with all of you today. One of the very best things that has happened to me this year is I got appointed to be adjunct faculty at Lancaster Theological Seminary, and in the fall I get to teach a class called Preaching with Screens. And my very first lesson in that class will be, don't ever preach with the screen without having a tech rehearsal first. So would you like to guess how much of a tech rehearsal Mark and I have had? So everybody wave at Mark. He is working on the fly, and if this gets all screwed up, do you remember back when they did film strips and you wanted to advance it and it said beep? I'll just beep Mark if we get all screwed up, and we won't worry about it at all. Now, in this particular sermon, if we had ourselves a passel of kids, we would be in really good shape. But I just saw a passel of them walk out down the hallway there, and I wasn't fast enough to go snag them. So what I would like you to do is find your bulletin. It has the scripture reading in it. And I want you to imagine that we have got ourselves a bunch of kids right here, and we are using the kids to help us imagine the camera angles in this passage. I want us to imagine that we are filming it. And if we had kids, we would have one of them be Jesus, and one would be the blind guy. A bunch of them would be the disciples, one would be Peter. And what we would be looking at is to see where Jesus is in relation to the other characters in this story. So we're going to read it, and I will kind of use my hands to pretend like they are the kids acting out the story. And let's see what we can see. So they came to Bethsaida, and some people brought a blind man to Jesus and begged him to heal him. And Jesus took the blind man by the hand and led him outside the village. And when he had spit on the blind man's eyes, this part is always great with kids. When he had spit on the blind man's eyes and placed his hands on him, Jesus asked, "Do you see anything?" And he looked up and he said, "I see people, and they look like trees walking around." And once more, Jesus put his hands on the man's eyes. And then his eyes were opened and his sight was restored, and he saw everything clearly. And Jesus sent him home, saying, "Don't even go into the village." And then Jesus and his disciples were walking down the road on the villages around Caesarea Philippi. And along the way, Jesus asked them, "Who do people say that I am?" And they replied, "Some say that you are John the Baptist, others Elijah, and still others one of the prophets." "But what about you?" Jesus asked. "Who do you say that I am?" Jesus said, "You're the Messiah." And Jesus warned them not to tell anyone about him. Jesus then began to teach them that the Son of Man must suffer many things and be rejected by the elders, the chief priests, and the teachers of the law, and that he must be killed and after 3 days rise again. Jesus spoke plainly about this. And then Peter took him aside and began to rebuke him. But Jesus turned his back on Peter and turned and looked at the disciples. And he rebuked Peter, saying, "Get behind me, Satan. You do not have in mind the concerns of God, but only the concerns of humans." Then Jesus called to the crowd along with his disciples, and facing them, he said, "Whoever wants to be my disciple must deny themselves and take up their cross and follow me. For whoever wants to save their life will lose it, but whoever loses their life for me and for my sake and the gospel's will save it. For what good is it for someone to gain the whole world, yet forfeit their soul? For what can anyone give in exchange for their soul? The word of the Lord. So I have to confess to you that I am old enough to remember the original movie Star Wars when it first came to the movie theaters. It was on the 10th anniversary, the 20th anniversary of Star Wars, that I happened to be listening to an NPR commentator. And she was talking about being in her apartment in Georgetown and looking out her window at 5:30 one morning, and there lined up were hundreds of people waiting to get into the movie theater to see Star Wars on the big screen for the first time in 20 years. And as she looked down, she saw a story. And so down she went to interview all of the people gathered in lines. They had been waiting all night long in order to get in. In those days, the first time a movie could show was at 5:30 in the morning. And so they were waiting for the first legal showing of the 20th anniversary of Star Wars. So she made her way up the line, one by one. Many of them had not been old enough to see Star Wars in the movie theater when it had first released. So why were they 20-somethings waiting in line all night to see a movie that most of them knew by heart? They had seen it on, anybody remember something called a VCR? They had watched it on their videotapes going backward and forward. They knew every line by heart. Help me, Obi-Wan Kenobi. You're our only hope. Why were they waiting all night long in February in Georgetown to watch a movie they knew? When she got to the very first line, there was a young man who said, Star Wars was the very first movie I ever saw. Star Wars was the first movie that I ever saw. And after that, nothing was ever the same again. Suddenly, I was lifted up and I was plunged back. It was 1977, and the love of my life, I think his name was Paul, he called me up and he said, there's a new movie. I saw it yesterday. It's a science fiction movie. I've got to see it today. You've got to come with me. I said, okay, what's it called? He said, Star Wars. Well, I wasn't much on science fiction, but I sure was into Paul. And so we stepped into the Metroplex. It was a blazing summer afternoon in Southern California. The sidewalk was literally hot enough to fry an egg, still in the shell. And we stepped into the movie theater. And there it unfolded for the very first time. The second day in play, a long time ago in a galaxy far, far away. 2 hours later, we came walking back out again. And as I went to put my foot onto the sidewalk, it seemed like the sidewalk was moving. The world had speeded up in those 2 hours that we were inside the movie theater. Much later, when I started to study film, I understood why. Star Wars as a movie unfolds the way that movies unfold, all of them that we had ever seen. We sit out there as the audience, and it scrolls by, we watch the audience. But there comes a moment about almost to the end of the movie theater, of the movie, when suddenly, as Luke and the Jedi fighters are spiraling down into the Death Star Canyon, the movie reaches out and it pulls us in. It goes from the third-person perspective, watching the action go by, to what's called a first-person perspective. It is like we are just there in the cockpit with Luke. And from that moment, we are pulled in, and there is no separation between us and the film. If you can pull it up, Mark, let's watch. So I got to preach this sermon in a sermon where there were a bunch of kids, and I started to talk right here, and a kid leaned over to another one and said, "Darn it." Did you see it? The moment where movie-making history changes. It reaches out and it pulls us in, and we are speeded up at that moment. The world is turning faster, and movies are never the same again. This moment, Jesus with his disciples, is that fulcrum moment in his ministry. After it, nothing is ever the same again. The sequence starts, Jesus is walking along with his disciples. And they have been in Bethsaida. He has led the blind man out of the village. He spits on his eyes, he sees once, and they look like ants. They look like walking trees. And then he spits on him again, and his sight is restored fully. He tells him not to go along in the village, and then Jesus is walking along the disciples and teaching. And he inquires, what do people think that he is? And people see him much like a walking tree. They think he's Elijah. They think he's Moses. Peter has a moment in which his eyesight is healed, and he sees Jesus clearly and says, "You're the Messiah." But then Jesus, walking alongside them, begins to teach them that they are going to Jerusalem, and when they arrive, he will embrace the hard wood of the cross for Emma Kathleen, for us. And Peter loses his new vision and takes Jesus aside and begins to rebuke him. So at that moment, Jesus turns his back on Peter. He turns towards the disciples and he teaches them. And that still is not enough. This teaching is too hard for us. And finally, Jesus says, if you want to be my disciple, you must follow after me. There is actually in the English no word that captures that follow after me. It's a word that has a physics to it. It has thrust, it has force. It is like a mother duckling. Have any of you ever seen a mother duck in the water? And she creates a wake, and the baby ducks follow in the wake. They're not strong enough to paddle by themselves. But in the wake of the mother duckling, they follow after her down the stream. Or it is like being a Jedi fighter. It is like all of you out in the audience watching the action, and all of a sudden, Jesus reaches out and says, all of you new recruits, guess what? You get to climb in the cockpit. You are going to spiral into the canyon of the Death Star. You are going to follow Darth Vader, and you're likely to lose your life in the process. How many of you are in? Jesus knows that we of ourselves do not have the capacity to follow after. There's a kids' hymn that we used to sing at baptisms that has a line in it that goes, and one was a doctor and one was a priest, and one was killed by a fierce wild beast, and there isn't a reason, oh no, not the least, that I don't want to be one too. And I remember hearing that as a kid and saying, well, wait a minute, what about the wild beast? There is a reason. This is a journey to Jerusalem. We are following Jesus And we need to be pulled in the wake, because we do not have the capacity of ourselves. This is a journey we are on this Lent to the cross. And following after takes more than we have. So Jesus has mercy on his disciples and no longer walks alongside to persuade, no longer stands in front to teach. He says, "Follow after me, and in my wake you will be pulled." Now, the reason that we follow after is the story doesn't stop there. If we had continued to read, and when we do this with kids, the place where the disciples go next is up on the Mount of Transfiguration. And there, their eyes are healed. Some scholars believe that what is transfigured on the Mount of Transfiguration is not Jesus. Jesus doesn't change. It is our eyes as disciples that for a moment change. And we see Jesus as he really is. It becomes the moment that we really see. And after that, nothing is ever the same again. Now, the reason that we need to really see is this following after is hard work. It means, first of all, that we have to follow from. We are following Jesus and we are leaving behind. We have to leave behind our stuff. We have to leave behind our trauma. We have to let the dead bury their dead. We have to leave behind the old ways that we do stuff. And when we follow after and when we are pulled in the wake, then we really begin to see. And what we see is not only Jesus transfigured and in beauty, but then we see this world that is in clay pots transfigured as well. I was in a church service once where a preacher said, "You know what? Look around you at the people next to you in the pew. Do it right now. Look at the people here next to you. You are going to spend all eternity with these people." And there was another kid in that service that said, "Mom, can we go join a different church?" When we are following in the wake of Jesus, pulled in, and when our eyes are transfigured and we really see, you realize that the people next to you are transfigured with light. They're not walking trees. They are God's beloved. And then you do crazy things like go to Argentina and stay up all night and come back and baptize babies. And you go out into the world on 30-hour famines and scatter across the city. You follow in the wake in places that you would never go. When we see Jesus transfigured, in his mighty power, he pulls us in to follow. And then we see the kingdom in all of its glory. The moment comes when we really see, and nothing is ever the same again. In that moment, we follow with joy, with our whole hearts. And we realize to be pulled into the wake is to be pulled into a universe of delight. So this Lent, as you follow, may it be with joy and with trust. And may the force be with you. Amen.